Henry King first met Albert Speer, one of the major defendants of the Nuremberg trials, at the Nuremberg prison in the late summer of 1946. King was interrogating Speer in connection with his role as the chairman of the Central Planning Board, the body that had supreme authority for the scheduling of German production.
Count Munner would fit into any execution squad in the world. I mean, he's head of the Gestapo. He had a big scar on his face. He's the man who denied his signature. Frank was the head of the Munich, the Bavarian Bar Association. He was Hitler's lawyer. But he was consumed with ambition, and he lost sense of humanity. In other words, there's no, all he was thinking of was crawling up the ladder, and he had a lot of internal fights with Himmler's people. Frank's a sad story. He gave us 42 volumes of diaries, and then we read them into the record against him, and he was hung as a result. Ribbentrop was a weak sister, just a champagne salesman, and Hitler wanted a weak sister in the foreign ministry. Pretty shabby for a foreign minister for a country of the size and scope of Germany. Salko was a Gauleiter from Thuringia, and he was a tough guy. He'd been on submarines, I believe, out in the North Atlantic. It was a slave labor boss, a very brutal man. And the main thing about Salko was he said he had 12 children, and what were they going to do if he was hung? Which didn't keep the court from hanging him. Salko blamed it all to Speer, and said that Speer should take the responsibility. Frick was Minister of Interior. He's a guy who established the rule of Hitler's law in Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg laws and all that, and more of a mechanic who enforced Hitler's dicta, gave him whatever respectability they ever had, but a real bad actor. Stryker was a questionable case. He was a mean, nasty guy, the type that hangs around playgrounds and molests people. One of the things was that the court, I don't think, liked Stryker. And he wasn't party to any of the killings. Even Hitler disengaged him from the party. He's a mean old, dirty old man. Then there was...
he was kind of the party ideologue, right?
Well, he was for early on, but then Hitler he didn't like Stryker because he didn't have any class or anything. He's just a vulgar old man. But Die Stürmer, which is the Nuremberg newspaper. Then you had Seyss-Inquart, who was the Governor General of Holland, Netherlands. And of course, he got nailed with all the crimes that they committed. He was an Austrian lawyer. Got nailed with all the crimes that the Nazis committed in Holland. He's the one who carried him out. He got the death sentence. Funk was a weak old man. He's the one who took the gold teeth from the dead as collateral for the Reichsbank and Jackson called it the strangest collateral in history. Funk was a weak sister guy who did the bidding of the stronger ones in the Nazi hierarchy. Fritcher should never have been there because he was a underling of Goebbels. They wanted somebody in the foreign ministry, and he was acquitted. Schack was sent to a concentration camp by Hitler, and he was acquitted. He was in a concentration camp, I believe, at the end of the war. Von Papen was a schemer and a scoundrel, but he didn't do any identifiable crimes during the Hitler regime because Hitler made him ambassador to Turkey, which at that time was Siberia for von Papen. Then, of course, you had Albert Speer, who was the one who said, I did it, I'm responsible. And the court liked that because he's the only one who said, Hitler's not here, I'm the one. So you have to keep in mind the court were human beings, they had feeling, and everybody else is in denial, and here's this guy who said, wow, I'm the one. And he had on a very close vote, he was given 20 years. Dönitz was an unreconstructed Nazi. The problem was that he was Hitler's successor. The problem we had was that Admiral Nimitz gave an affidavit saying that we had done some of the things that we're trying Dönitz on, but there were other things that we didn't do. Also, it's unlikely that any prosecution would ever let, or any court would ever let Dönitz off, who was the successor to Hitler. He's a real Nazi when I was there. Rader was the commander of the Nazi Navy. He sat in some planning meetings and paid with a life sentence for that, where they planned the war. The meetings of November 3rd, November 1937, November 4th.
People portrayed in their actual photographs and described by Henry King, and many of them he described them as weak sisters, as champagne salesmen. Did you get a sense of sort of reaffirmation of what you did with these lithographs where you tried to depict? You know,
yes, I did.
You could back. Yeah.
Okay, yes, I did. It really convinced me that these were men who should have known better than to back someone like Hitler. They had the education, they had the sophistication. They should have known that they were backing, ultimately, a loser. And they didn't.
Were you destined to be an artist? Is your family, is that a thing in your family?
No one in my family was an artist. My maternal grandfather was a sofer who wrote and repaired Torahs in Hebrew. And he may have been an inspiration for me because he was a marvelous craftsman and calligrapher.
Now, you're a second-generation American, and your
Yes.
parents came from Russia.
Yes.
Where did they settle?
Well, my maternal grandfather came from Russia a few years before he was able to bring his 6 daughters, 1 son, and his wife over. My mother was 8 years old when she came in 1908. 10 years later, she was married to my father, who had come over as a single immigrant in 1913, I believe. And I was the second of 3 boys born to my parents. The first 6 years of my life, I thought I was a rich kid because my father had a new and used furniture store on an important street in Providence, Rhode Island. Then the Depression came. I had a brother who was born a few years during the Depression. And as an adult, I suddenly realized that all my life, my parents had rented tenements, never owned a house, never owned an automobile until after the war. But, you know, in a child's eyes, growing up in a comfortable, loving, extended family, I just assumed I was rich, like the equivalent of any other rich kid. About being an artist, I was a behavior problem. They didn't have Prozac at the time, and my mother said the only way she could get me to be quiet was to put a pencil and a piece of paper in my hand and say, draw my picture. And during that time, I must have done countless naive drawings of people that came out looking like George Washington.
You went to the Rhode Island School of Design.
Yes.
And then you sort of made a quantum leap and headed towards Paris. Why
Yes, well, I went to school, a local art school, in 1940 after graduating high school. It seemed the logical thing to do. I didn't know about the wider world that existed. In New York, for example, with the Art Students League, or at Yale, which had a bona fide studio art program. So as a scholarship student, I went to RISD. In my second year, I was drafted, went to the infantry, wound up in the combat engineers. 3 years later, the war was over. I had the GI Bill. I immediately went to New York City in the winter of 1945. At that time, it was very hostile. There wasn't housing, and I was living very meanly in Greenwich Village. And one of the major artists at the time, DeGulis, put his arm around me and said, "Kid, you're stupid. Go back to school. The government is going to pay your tuition. Your generation will have opportunities that mine never had." I took his advice, went back to the Rhode Island School of Design, and I finished in 47. That was the year many European artists who had been in the United States during the war years returned to Europe. And I was fortunate. The American school at Fontainebleau opened. I went there, and then I went to Paris. Fortunately, Fernand Léger had come back from the States and opened a school. I attended that. I had no idea about making a living, but I was told there were teaching jobs available in the United States. So I wrote to several schools, and fortunately, the Ohio State University, which had a marvelous studio program, hired me. I think I had an edge based on my European study experience. Well, to make a long story short, much to my surprise and the university, I finished my career there as an emeritus professor, and I took early retirement at age 60, 25 years ago, to be a full-time artist, get rid of that hyphen, teacher-artist. And fortunately, my health has been good. I have a bionic knee. A good deal of my mind is still active. And I still have enough of the skills to continue to make art.
So much so that many of your, much of your artwork has been in collections through many of the major museums in the country. Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Smithsonian, the Pierpont, Morgan Library, the Dollar Museum in Berlin, the New York Public Library, and on and on and on throughout the world. And I guess that's a real true testament to the fact that...
Yeah. Well, you need a certain amount of luck to get through life. And fortunately, I seem to have been in the right place at the right time.
With regards to the exhibit which we have here at the Jackson Center, what inspired you to do that?
Well, I came out of the war. Before the war, I knew about the atrocities the Germans were committed against Jews. As an American Jew, I was absolutely motivated to make a statement about the Holocaust. I made cadavers after cadavers after cadavers, and I realized Margaret Burke White had documented this far more effectively than I could. And then I had a eureka moment. In all of my readings about German history at the time, I realized that the social conditions helped create Hitler. The Versailles Treaty after World War I was so severe that it left Germany in great economic and social distress. A lot of the German soldiers had arms, the Freikorps, and they were running around Germany intimidating people. They were thugs who were armed. Hitler was rabble-rousing on street corners, and he developed a following. He was put in jail, and he wrote Mein Kampf together with the help of other prisoners. And it astounded me that men with education, men with professional training in law, in architecture, in journalism, in the military, said Hitler is our way out of our problems. They backed the wrong horse. I did extensive reading on that period. Every book on the Nazi period, written by Germans, written by English, written by Americans, I read thoroughly. And I said, my project will be didactic about the men who chose their lot to support Hitler in his murderous, contemptuous reign of terror. And that's how it started. I started the program using lithography. Lithography is a 19th century process of reproducing art. Instead of using cumbersome stones, as in Toulouse-Lautrec's day, we now have aluminum plates that have the characteristics of the limestone. And I used these as drawing paper. And out of my reading came these 42 prints of perpetrators.
Not all of them are German.
No. Unfortunately, Quisling is a name now in the dictionary. Quisling is a man who betrays his own country. I also have the Muslim leader of Jerusalem. He backed Hitler, lived in Berlin. When Berlin got too hot, he moved to Rome. The Jews had no homeland, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem did not want Jews in Palestine. And so he was a very rabid backer of the German regime. Who else to Husband, who was so damned optimistic, he believed every lying word that Hitler said. He should have known better. So those are the three, I believe, that are in there, and deservedly so.
Such individuals as Arthur Rudolph, who most people would not have known, but his story is such that it shows a little bit of the hypocrisy of the whole thing. Here he's the director of the V-2 bomb production, 1943-45, and then was brought to the United States with laundered dossiers, as you placed it. Rudolph was project director of Redstone Arsenal, Pershing Missiles, and Saturn V Moon Project, became a U.S. citizen in 1957, awarded Distinguished Service Medal. When the Office of Special Investigation began denaturalization proceedings, Rudolph renounced his United States citizenship and returned to West Germany in 1984. It's an amazing little story.
Well, we have to go back to the end of the war. We had the bomb. There were German scientists who were very well advanced in rocket research. The Germans had developed the V-1 rocket, which was aimed at European ports, namely Antwerp. The buzz bomb, the V-2, which was a terror bomb, which landed indiscriminately in London. Now, all the nations, the French, the Russians, and the Americans, went through Europe at the end of the war, when they knew the war was lost for Germany, and enticed the German scientists to come to their respective countries. In America, the operation is described as Operation Paperclip. The naval intelligence officers scoured all through Germany, making enticements, saying, come to the United States, we will take care of you. Well, Rudolph was one of those. Von Braun came with an entourage of 60 of his associates, including his chauffeur and his cook. And he had the knowledge that we could use. We must remember that Russia was the big threat after World War II. When I was mustered out of the Army in 1945, I was told, don't get too damn comfortable, because you are going to be back in service before you know it. We're going to kill those commies. So go ahead, go back, enjoy the good life for a few weeks, but we're taking you back. And that was the atmosphere.
Did you get a sense, given that atmosphere, and you were in the Battle of the Bulge,
Yes.
and you were injured there, you were wounded there.
Yeah, I spent 3 months in English hospitals after the Battle of the Bulge. I thought I would lose my feet, but fortunately, I was in one of those wards where instead of amputating, they used a new miracle drug called lanolin, sheep fat. And we were bedridden for 3 months, whirlpools. Fortunately, I have my feet. I wish they'd saved my mind as well.
You know, we never really asked the question. We've had several vets here, but as you just indicated, where they advised you stay loose when you're
Yes.
mustered out, that we may have a different enemy all of a sudden here.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about the confusion that must have caused within the ranks. In one sense, the Russians were your allies. You defeated the enemy, the German, the Axis armies, the German, the Italians.
Yeah.
And then to have that kind of ambiguous piece of information.
Well, Bolshevism has been the big bugaboo in America since the First World War. And many demagogues, American demagogues, have made very good careers bashing communism and Bolshevism. You know, the Dies Committee immediately following World War I, plus Joe McCarthy, which many of you may remember. But we also had a big socialist movement with Eugene Debs running for presidency. And the Depression scared a lot of people. Capitalism was under assault because obviously the Depression had made people think, is this our best system of government? Fortunately, yes, it is. But another question.
Well, it's interesting because it does tie in a little bit with what was going on at Nuremberg at that time.
Yes.
After the first trial, of which much of these pictures and what you've depicted in your exhibit dealt with specific 21 defendants, of which are part of your Perpetrators exhibit. Then there were those subsequent trials, of which, Adrian, we talked about, and the judgment in Nuremberg.
Yes.
And as things proceeded along, the real henchmen of the Nazi, the real henchmen, the Perpetrators, there was influence from on high to kind of wrap up these Nuremberg trials, because we may need these Germans as allies.
Yes.
And those that were convicted of the subsequent trials, all of a sudden their sentences got commuted. It got really strange. And so that time period, the late 40s, early 50s, the
Yes.
Joe McCarthy, was a difficult period. And you being an artist, and specifically Hollywood artists, and everybody was sort of somehow in harm's way there. In your community as an artist, I know we're off the subject a little bit, but did you get a sense of that in Columbus, Ohio, or was Columbus just far enough removed from what was going on in Washington?
When I came to Columbus in '48, it was a very reactionary southern city. We're very close to Appalachia. We had a very conservative newspaper, and the university is located just a few miles north of downtown. And the newspaper took it upon itself to censor speakers at the university. And one of my series of prints is academic satires, because the local newspaper took a very active role in promoting democracy with a capital R for republicanism. And eventually, enough of the university faculty stood up and said, we are dedicated to the promotion of free speech and free research, and we will invite whomever we damn please. And it formed the basis of a big series of academic satires. Fortunately, truth won out.
So do you go from being in various exhibits, and by the way, there's a couple of books out on there which Sid's magnificent career dealing with a lot of satire, and yet your subject matter here at the Perpetrators is really anything but that.
Yes.
Very biographical, and you use a style, boy, I'm no artist, so I can't even pretend to go down this road, but I noticed in just your capitalization, there's a style. Could you explain that?
Yes. I wanted the big letters as emphasis. You know, an artist designs his work, her work, my work, to tell a story briefly, and I wanted to emphasize certain words so that as your eye scanned the text, certain words would be more prominent than others. So it was a poetic license, artistic license.
I've noticed you emphasize the meaning of many of the key words like hate, life, guilty, hanged, humanity.
Yes.
Those are sort of action items, and I assume that's what you're trying to accomplish there.
Yeah, well, you know, sometimes you have to emphasize certain words. Sometimes you shout, sometimes you whisper.
Doing the research on the Gehrings, the Hesses, the Ribbentrops.
Yeah.
What, if you looked at that, some of which you probably knew from just living that time period, some of which you said, I can't believe that. Do you recall any specific individuals where it just sort of jumped off at you and said, wow, I had no idea?
Well, selecting from the group of Nazis was very, very difficult. I had to make choices. And over the 2-year period that I worked on this project, I arbitrarily picked out those from enough of the different professions, the military, the law. You know, for example, Frank, who was the governor of all of the Polish provinces, lived like a king. He had the best food. He had the best art hanging in his living quarters. These people would go home to their wife and children and forget about the mayhem, the murder and brutality they had inflicted with their policies. And, you know, that struck me as, you know, how could these people live with themselves? How could these men go to shave in the morning and look at their face in the mirror and not feel absolute disgust at their behavior? These were not stupid men. You know, out of that bunch, only one of them was really a low scum individual, the journalist. Stryker, yeah. He was such a deep anti-Semite that he never had a brain a rational thought in his head, I thought. More questions?
The camps themselves. So one of them, it was really striking to me. It's the identification where you have 4 separate symbols. You know, you got the red, the yellow, red, green, pink.
Yeah.
Why did you select that?
Well, this is a way of identifying the prisoners in the camps. They had political prisoners. They had a certain color armband. They had homosexuals. They had a certain color armband. What were the one was Jewish. They had their own armband. What was the other one?
Yeah, the common one was green. The homosexual was pink. Political was red, and the yellow and red was Jewish.
Yeah.
As well as the tattoo numbers.
Yeah.
The other thing that struck me that you wonderfully depict some of the individuals, like Heydrich and Goebbels, in 2 separate lithographs. One showing the family side of this.
Yes.
And then the other in a very much biographical sense about that. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, again, these were men who had wives and loving children, and they'd go home each night and live a normal life, you know, bouncing their children on their knees, and, you know, completely shutting out their other aspects. Heydrich was assassinated in Czechoslovakia, and in reprisal, the whole town was simply wiped off the map. Lidice in Czechoslovakia. And sometimes there are too many similarities happening in our present administration. Suppression of, you know, unfortunately, you know, what we're doing with our justice. Abu Ghraib is an absolute disgrace. We should not be involved in the atrocities that occurred at Abu Ghraib. The Germans flatly rejected the Geneva Convention. And the United States is far better in its devotion to liberty, that we have to stoop to those levels. Desperate times demand desperate methods, but we certainly should not give up our basic, fundamental way of government.
I think you'd have lots of people applaud that. In your research on the perpetrators, and I think I read someplace that as you were looking at some of the photographs upon which you based your lithographs, you went back to the Nuremberg photos and Nuremberg record. I have to ask the question, what did you learn about Robert Jackson along the way?
Well, I've always admired Robert Jackson. One of my series of prints is Cultural Heroes, and I intend to add Robert Jackson to that list. I'll do it, and I'll give it to you, Peterson, and
we'll have it right up here.
Maybe you can raise money for the organization.
I would love it. That's terrific. Yeah. So noted. I want you to know there's lots of film going on here. You have accomplished much here, but if they're in the Perpetrators exhibit, as we will be having lots of students, we got lots of teachers here in our midst, what's the walk away? What would you like them to feel as they walk through your exhibit and say, this is my artist's statement?
Well, I hope the message is that this was a period of time in which a cultured, civilized, supposedly country resorted to such terrible means of conquest. The Holocaust should not have happened in the 20th century. What is happening today in Darfur should never be happening in the 21st century. Somehow we continue to disregard history. And my new project is very emotional for me. I expect more from our country. I want to add one thing. I have been at the university, fortunately, for my adult career. I came to the Ohio State University with absolute stars in my eyes. Here I was going to be part of a great institution dedicated to the advancement of knowledge and truth. Unfortunately, I found there was a lot of politicking. I was happy to have a job, to have a paycheck at the end of the month. I was happy to have benefits. And it didn't happen only in my own department, but seemingly throughout the whole university, that there was a lot of departmental politicking that I felt had no place in an institution of learning. I'm getting off the subject.
I can see your passion. You've shared that passion in many ways, and the passion that this person who wrote the preface, when he walked in, and he said he was profoundly moved. When you walk in there today, and maybe you haven't seen the exhibit in a while. I don't know, how long has it been since you've actually seen your work? What's when you walk in, if it's been a while, and you walk in there today and you see this, is this just the same thing you've seen before, or do you see something new in your work when you walk in there like today?
The best thing for me is to have it up on the walls and having people see it and to come and ask questions. I especially like this exhibition when it was shown at colleges. And in many colleges, they assigned the exhibition to the students, especially freshman students. And I was astounded how little they knew about World War II and how little they knew about the Holocaust and that it even existed. So the gratifying thing to me is that it is an exhibition that is seen and it provokes discussion and renewed interest in a terrible period of the 20th century.
And it's our hope that we realize your hope here at the Jackson Center by having this exhibit of Perpetrators, encourage those students, many of them here, teachers, come and walk away with a real sense of remembrance. Because as you mentioned, as part of the Jackson Center legacy is that which occurred in Nuremberg, we are seeing again. And whether it's Darfur, whether it's Yugoslavia, Rwanda, those trials are occurring again. And hopefully over time we won't forget.
Yes.
The Holocaust will not be forgotten. And that perhaps sort of the international rule of law, which you were just talking about, will be sustained. So I can't thank you enough for making the special effort. They drove in from Columbus today just to make this a special evening with us. And so to Adrian and you, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.